Imagine it. Rain still clinging to the wheat. Smoke still hanging low over the ridgeline, and in the middle of it all, a single French eagle standard planted on a ridge that, by every rule of history, Napoleon Bonaparte was never supposed to take. Because if Napoleon wins at Waterloo, it isn't just a battle that changes. It's a lock that clicks open. And for a brief, dangerous window, about 48 hours, the entire future of Europe stops being inevitable, and becomes negotiable. Not in grand speeches, not in marble halls, but in mud, blood, and exhausted men stumbling over broken fences while empires hold their breath, waiting to see whether the age of revolution is truly dead, or about to rise again. And here's the uncomfortable truth. Napoleon didn't need to conquer Europe to remake it. He only needed to survive. To understand why those 48 hours matter, we have to step into the world as it actually was in June of 1815. Europe is tired. Not politically tired. Not diplomatically tired. Tired the way a continent becomes tired after 20 years of war. After sons are buried in fields they never knew existed. After treasuries become hollow. After kings and ministers look into maps and see nothing but bleeding borders. Napoleon is supposed to be finished. A year earlier, the Allies had pushed him out and exiled him to Elba, a tiny island like a cage with a seawall. The Bourbon monarchy returned to France, wearing the crown like a borrowed coat. The powers of Europe, Britain, Prussia, Austria, Russia, began reshaping the continent at the Congress of Vienna, carving borders and restoring order, convinced the revolutionary storm had finally passed. Then Napoleon escaped. He landed in France with a few hundred men, and something even stronger than an army, the force of a legend. Troops sent to arrest him defected. Cities opened their gates, and Louis XVIII, the restored king, fled. The 100 Days began, and with it, a massive question hovering over Europe like thunder. Was this going to be another decade of war? Or could they crush him quickly, one decisive blow, and end the Napoleonic era forever? So the coalition mobilized again, faster than they had ever mobilized for anyone. Not because they hated France, not because they feared French people, because they feared Napoleon as an idea, that one man could topple the order they were rebuilding. And Napoleon knew that. He knew he had no time. He knew that if the coalition armies combined, if Wellington, Blucher, the Austrians, and the Russians all converged on France at once, then even he would be overwhelmed. So he did what Napoleon always did when the walls started closing in. He moved first. He marched north into Belgium to strike the nearest armies, before they could unite. The Anglo-Allied army under the Duke of Wellington, and the Prussian army under Field Marshal Blucher. This is the trap he wants. Hit one, then the other, win fast, and force Europe to the negotiating table before it can gather enough steel to crush him. That's the plan. And in real history, the plan fails. But today, we're stepping sideways, into a world where it doesn't. Into a world where Waterloo is not the tomb of Napoleon's empire, but the opening chapter of something stranger. It begins the same way. The sky over Belgium is heavy. The ground is soaked. Artillery wheels sink into mud. Soldiers sleep on damp straw. Horses breathe steam into the morning air. Across from Napoleon's army, Wellington's men wait behind a ridge near a road junction called Waterloo. It's a defensive position, hidden slopes, solid farms turned into fortresses, and the steady discipline of troops who have been drilled to hold. And behind Wellington, somewhere out there, Blucher is coming. The Prussians were beaten at Ligny 2 days earlier, but not destroyed. They are bruised, angry, and retreating, and in real history, they returned to the battlefield just in time to save Wellington and doom Napoleon. So the entire hinge of history sits on a brutal, simple question. Does Napoleon destroy Wellington before the Prussians arrive? Or do the Prussians arrive before Wellington breaks? Now, in our alternate timeline, we give Napoleon the one thing he didn't have enough of at Waterloo: time used perfectly. It doesn't require magic. It doesn't require superhuman strategy. It requires a few decisions to land differently. A slightly earlier start. More decisive coordination. Less hesitation at the worst possible moment. And most importantly, the Prussians are delayed. Just enough. In the early hours, Napoleon sees the field and understands what the mud means. Mud slows cavalry charges. Mud blunts artillery. Mud turns every movement into a crawl. So instead of letting the morning drag, Instead of waiting for the ground to dry, as the clock ticks toward Prussian arrival, Napoleon pushes his timetable forward. The first French guns open earlier. Infantry columns begin their grim, steady advance. At Hougoumont, one of Wellington's strongpoints, a savage fight erupts as it did in real history. The farm becomes a furnace. Men fire through loopholes, slam doors shut against bayonets, reload with shaking hands as screams echo off stone walls. But in this version, Napoleon resists the trap of obsession. He doesn't pour more and more men into that burning farm just to take it out of pride. Instead, he treats it like what it is, a pin, not a prize. He uses pressure there to keep Wellington's right locked in place, while he shifts weight elsewhere. And then comes the center. The French attack rolls toward La Haye-Sainte, another key position, defended by men whose ammunition is running low even as the afternoon approaches. In real history, the French take that farmhouse too late to exploit it fully. Here, they take it earlier, and that changes everything, because once La Haye-Sainte falls, Wellington's center is no longer a protected ridge, it's a cracked wall. Napoleon's artillery, freed from mud just enough to bite, can finally rake the slope. Not perfectly, but enough. And every cannonball that tears through ranks is more than death. It is a message. It says, we can reach you. It says, this hill is not safe. Wellington rides behind his line, calm and cold, and he understands that too. And somewhere to the east, Blücher is trying to move his battered army through bad roads and worse confusion, and the minutes he loses are minutes Wellington cannot afford. Here's the curiosity spike, the moment that makes historians lean forward. If the Prussians are even 1 hour later than they were in reality, Wellington's battlefield math collapses. Because Wellington's entire plan is not win, it's hold until help arrives. If help arrives late, holding becomes dying. Then the French cavalry charges come. Masked horsemen surge up the slope, sabers flashing, hooves pounding wet earth. In real history, these charges are poorly supported and smash themselves against British squares, tight formations bristling with bayonets. Men staring down death with discipline and terror. And here, yes, the squares form again. Men kneel, bayonets lock, horses refuse to impale themselves. The cavalry swirls, frustrated, circling like a storm. But this time the cavalry isn't sent alone. Again and again, wasting itself. This time, Napoleon times combined arms more tightly. Infantry follows closer. Artillery moves up earlier to fire canister into squares the moment they waver. And the pressure becomes something else. Not a dramatic breakthrough in one heroic charge, but a slow, suffocating compression. As the afternoon bleeds into evening, Wellington's line begins to look less like a solid ridge and more like a set of bruised, isolated islands. Hougoumont is still resisting, but it's also burning through men. The center is under fire. The left watches the horizon for Prussians that aren't quite here yet. And then comes the moment that decides this alternate universe. Napoleon commits the Imperial Guard. In real history, he commits too late, and the Guard is repulsed. That repulse becomes the psychological crack that shatters the French army. But here, with La Haye-Sainte already taken, with Wellington's center already softened, with the Prussians delayed and still distant, Napoleon sends the Guard while there is still something to break. They climb the slope. They are not just soldiers, they are symbols. Veterans, hardened men, the last reserve of an emperor who understands that if he wins this, he might win everything. Wellington's men fire. They fire again. Some Guard units falter, some push through. And a gap opens. Not a clean gap, not a cinematic hole. A human gap. An exhausted regiment falls back, and the regiment next to it has already lost half its officers. And suddenly the ridge isn't a ridge anymore, it's a line of men who realize, at the same time, that they might not be able to hold. Wellington is brilliant and stubborn, but he is not a magician. If his center breaks, he cannot fix it with courage. He can only retreat, or be surrounded. So in this world, Wellington gives the order he never wanted to give. Pull back. The ridge begins to empty. Not as a rout at first, more like a controlled withdrawal. But Napoleon's army does not need it to be a rout immediately. It only needs the British and Allied troops to lose the position. Because now Napoleon owns the field. And owning the field changes the next 48 hours more than the casualty numbers ever could. Now the question becomes, what does a Napoleon victory actually look like? It isn't necessarily total annihilation. It's not the British army wiped out to the last man. It's Wellington retreating toward Brussels, trying to keep his forces together, trying to avoid being cut off from the coast. It's French cavalry harassing the withdrawal. It's guns firing into the road. It's wounded men left behind in the fields because wagons cannot carry everyone. And then, too late, the Prussians begin to appear. But instead of arriving to crush Napoleon's right flank at Waterloo, they arrive to find a battlefield already slipping away. They engage anyway, because Blücher is aggressive and proud. He does not like losing. But the timing is wrong. Napoleon can pivot. He can hold them off with parts of his army while he pursues Wellington with others. And that is the terrifying beauty of Napoleon's original campaign design. The coalition armies aren't dangerous when they're separated. They're dangerous when they combine. So in this alternate timeline, Napoleon has succeeded in keeping them from combining, at least for the moment that mattered most. This is where the 48 hours begins. Because within 2 days, Europe will decide whether Waterloo was a battle or a warning. The first night after the French victory is not celebration. It is exhaustion. Campfires flicker under wet skies. Doctors work by lantern light. Men sleep sitting up, too tired to lie down. Napoleon himself rides the field, seeing the dead, and he knows something few victors admit. Winning is expensive. And he cannot afford many more expensive wins. So his next move is not just military. It's political. Because if he can turn this victory into negotiation, into hesitation, into doubt among his enemies, then he buys what he truly needs. Time. And time, for Napoleon, is survival. He sends messages. Not just to Paris, but to Europe. He frames the battle as proof that the coalition can't simply remove him like a stain. He offers peace, again. And this is the part most people miss. Napoleon did offer peace in 1815. But Europe didn't believe him. They believed peace with Napoleon was temporary, a pause before another war. So now, after Waterloo, the question becomes, does a victorious Napoleon seem more dangerous, or more legitimate? That depends on how frightened the coalition is, and how much it fears the cost of continuing. Let's walk through them. Britain has money and a navy. Britain can fund war longer than almost anyone. But Britain also relies on coalition armies on land to do the bleeding. If Wellington's army is broken or forced back to the sea, Britain must either send more troops, slowly, or rely even more heavily on continental allies. Prussia is furious. It has been invaded before. It wants revenge, and it wants security. It does not want Napoleon restored permanently. A Prussia that has just been denied its victory moment will be even more determined. Austria is complicated. It is conservative, yes, but it is also tied to Napoleon through family. Napoleon's second wife was an Austrian archduchess. Austria wants stability more than glory. It will fight, but it will also calculate. Russia is far away, but massive. It has the manpower to keep coming. Yet Russian armies take time to arrive. And Russia also wants influence at the negotiating table. So in those 48 hours, what happens isn't a single decision. It's a spread of decisions. And Napoleon's biggest advantage, if he wins Waterloo, is psychological. He breaks the coalition's confidence that victory is inevitable. He turns certainty into debate, and debate into delay, and delay is oxygen. Now, let's be honest, even with a victory at Waterloo, Napoleon is still in a dangerous position. France has been at war for years. Its finances are strained. Its young men are fewer. Its enemies have larger combined forces. So a Waterloo victory doesn't automatically mean Napoleon marches into Berlin, Vienna, or Moscow. It means he gets a chance to avoid being crushed immediately. Which raises the core what if question. What would have happened if Napoleon used that chance perfectly? Here's one plausible path. Napoleon pursues Wellington aggressively but carefully, not chasing into a trap. Not stretching too far. The goal is to push the British and Allied army away from Brussels and toward evacuation points, making Britain's position in Belgium untenable. Simultaneously, he turns to face the Prussians with enough force to blunt them, perhaps even beating them in a follow-up action as they attempt to regroup. And then, instead of trying to conquer, he does something that feels almost un-Napoleonic. He consolidates. He pulls his army back into defensible positions. He fortifies. He prepares France for a defensive war. Because if Napoleon can force the coalition to invade France, again, he can attempt to repeat his classic strategy, defeat them in detail, one by one, using speed and interior lines. But he has a second tool in 1815 that he didn't always have in his earlier years. The language of constitutional legitimacy. During the 100 Days, Napoleon tried to present himself not as a dictator returning, but as a ruler who could accept a constitution, a legislature, limits, at least in theory. After a Waterloo victory, he leans into this hard. He tells France and Europe, "I am not the revolution's chaos. I am the revolution's order." He promises peace. He promises stability. He paints the coalition as invaders trying to decide who gets to rule France. And now, the war becomes harder to justify, especially for governments that fear revolutionary ideas spreading in their own populations. Because if Napoleon can look like France's choice, then the coalition doesn't look like liberators. It looks like occupiers. And that moral framing matters more than cannons in some moments. But what happens next still comes down to one terrifying question. Do the Allies accept a negotiated peace? Or do they double down, determined to finish him no matter the cost? Let's explore both outcomes, because history is rarely one straight line. Outcome 1. The coalition hesitates. In this scenario, Wellington's defeat forces Britain into a crisis of confidence. Parliament can still fund the war. Yes, but public appetite for endless European fighting is not infinite. And Britain's strength is naval and financial. It prefers to win without bleeding too deeply on land. Austria, seeing a chance to stabilize without total collapse, argues for negotiation, especially if Napoleon's posture shifts toward constitutional monarchy. Russia, far away, has to decide whether it wants to spend another year marching armies across Europe to remove a man who just proved he can still win. Prussia would protest, loudly, furiously. But coalitions fracture at the seams when costs rise and certainty falls. So peace talks begin. Not friendly talks, not trusting talks. Cold talks. Talks with knives under the table. Napoleon offers concessions, recognition of borders, perhaps giving up claims beyond France's natural borders, possibly accepting a reduced influence in the Netherlands and Italy. The coalition demands guarantees, maybe a return to pre-1792 borders, maybe the removal of Napoleon entirely. And this is where Napoleon's survival strategy becomes political theater. He may offer to rule as a constitutional monarch. He may offer to step aside in favor of his son, Napoleon II, while acting as regent. He may even offer exile again, but on terms that preserve French dignity. The coalition's ideal goal is simple: remove Napoleon permanently. But diplomacy isn't about ideal goals. It's about what you can force. And after a coalition defeat, forcing becomes harder. So in this outcome, Napoleon survives, not as the conqueror of Europe, but as the ruler of France in a begrudging peace. And that changes the 19th century drastically. Because if Napoleon remains, even in a limited role, it delays or reshapes the restoration politics of Europe. It alters the legitimacy of monarchies that had claimed the revolution is over. It influences nationalist movements. It shifts the balance in Germany and Italy. It changes the story people tell themselves about power, that a revolution can't simply be reversed if it's backed by a nation that refuses to be dictated to. And the Congress of Vienna's settlement becomes less permanent, less confident, more like a temporary patch. Now, would this lead to another war later? Possibly. But it could also create something unexpected, a cold peace, where Napoleon's France is watched, contained, pressured, but not invaded. A Europe living in tension, not triumph. And that tension could ripple into everything: colonial policy, domestic reform, the pace of industrial militarization, even culture, even identity. Because Napoleon's survival would keep the revolutionary era alive as a living memory, not a closed chapter. Outcome 2. The coalition doubles down. In this scenario, Waterloo doesn't frighten Europe into negotiation. It enrages it into unity. Britain pours money in. Prussia mobilizes harder. Austria and Russia commit fully. And instead of one coalition army moving cautiously, Napoleon now faces something like a continental wave. Even if Napoleon wins Waterloo, he still has to fight more battles. And he is fighting against a simple truth: the coalition has more depth, more reserves, more manpower. And France, in 1815, cannot conjure endless new armies the way it could in 1793. So Napoleon's best chance here is not conquest, but defense. Make invading France so painful that the coalition's political will cracks. But political will is a strange thing. In 1815, the coalition's will to remove Napoleon is unusually strong because they have seen what happens when he is left alive. So in this outcome, we may still end with Napoleon's fall, but not at Waterloo. At another battle, another moment, another field that history textbooks would be named after instead. And here is the eerie point: even if he loses later, a victory at Waterloo still changes the world because it changes how the world remembers him. In our timeline, Waterloo is the symbol of finality, the proof that the Napoleonic era ended. In this alternate, the era ends differently, messier, later, more uncertain. And uncertainty itself becomes historical fuel. Because the longer Napoleon remains a threat, the more Europe justifies stronger repression against revolutionary ideas. The more kings and ministers clamp down, the more fear spreads. So ironically, a Napoleonic victory could either prolong the revolutionary spirit, or provoke a harsher conservative backlash across Europe. Either way, the map of the 19th century shifts. Now let's zoom into those 48 hours again, because this is where the story becomes almost cinematic in its fragility. Picture the messengers. On muddy roads, riders push exhausted horses to collapse, carrying news that will hit capitals like lightning. In London, ministers stare at dispatches and try to understand what defeat means. Not just militarily, but psychologically. If Wellington is beaten, can the coalition still claim inevitability? In Berlin, Prussian leaders feel rage and humiliation. They mobilize not just armies, but national emotion. A Prussia denied its revenge becomes more radical in how it thinks about security. In Vienna, diplomats calculate. Austria's greatest fear is instability. Napoleon surviving keeps the revolutionary flame alive, and Austria hates that. But Austria also hates endless war. In St. Petersburg, the Tsar, powerful, distant, considers the long march west again, the cost in blood, and whether Europe will fracture if he pushes too hard. And in Paris, Napoleon receives the news of his victory, and the city exhales. Not because the war is over, but because for the first time in weeks, it feels like France isn't simply waiting to be occupied. The government rallies. The army gains confidence. And confidence is a weapon. Napoleon understands he has a short window to shape the narrative. So he becomes not just a commander, but a storyteller. He frames Waterloo as the moment France stood up against foreign kings deciding its fate. He speaks of sovereignty, of honor, of the right to choose. And that is dangerous language in 1815. Because it doesn't just threaten armies. It threatens ideas. If Napoleon can survive, the idea that a nation can overthrow a dynasty and defend its choice does not die in 1815. It becomes a precedent that revolutionaries in 1830 and 1848 could point to and say, it almost worked, it can work. And that, more than cannons, could remake Europe. So, what would the world look like decades later in the Napoleon wins Waterloo timeline? We need to be careful here, because the further we go, the more branches appear. But we can identify pressure points that would almost certainly shift. Germany and Italy. Nationalism accelerates or warps. Napoleon's earlier campaigns helped spread nationalist sentiment by reshaping borders and humiliating old powers. If Napoleon survives again, Even briefly, the question of German unity becomes sharper. Prussia may pursue unity more aggressively for security. Italy, long fragmented, might see stronger nationalist movements sooner or be crushed harder by conservative forces terrified of a Napoleonic revival. Britain, maritime dominance continues. But continental policy changes. Britain will still dominate the seas. But a Napoleon who survives forces Britain to decide whether it commits to deeper continental military involvement or doubles down on blockade and funding allies. France, a constitutional Napoleon is possible. If Napoleon survives through negotiation, France could evolve into a hybrid system, still Napoleonic, but with constitutional features that alter French political development. That would ripple into liberal movements across Europe, either as inspiration or as cautionary tale. Colonial competition, the timing shifts. The 19th century's imperial expansion might start under different pressures. A Europe still unsettled in 1815 to 1820 is a Europe with different priorities, different alliances, and possibly different colonial bargains. And perhaps the biggest change of all is psychological. Waterloo, in our world, becomes the story of the man who finally met his limit. In this alternate world, Waterloo becomes the story of the man who refused to die. And that changes the myth that shapes the century. But let's not romanticize it. A Napoleon who wins Waterloo is not automatically a benevolent liberator. He is still Napoleon, ambitious, controlling, brilliant, ruthless when necessary. His survival could mean more war later, not less. More conscription, not less. More repression, not less, especially if he believes internal dissent will invite invasion. And the coalition, terrified of what he represents, might respond with harsher conservatism and surveillance. So the true legacy of a Napoleonic victory might be a Europe that becomes more suspicious, more militarized, and more brittle. A continent that learns to fear ideas even more than armies. Which makes the central irony of Waterloo even sharper. The battle often feels like the end of an era. But if Napoleon wins, it becomes the beginning of a new kind of era, where Europe's future isn't decided by a single, final defeat, but by years of tension, negotiation, and the uneasy realization that history doesn't always close cleanly. And in the end, that's the real lesson hidden inside this, what if? History is not just built by grand plans. It's built by timing, by weather, by a delayed march, by a farmhouse taken an hour earlier than expected, by men who hold when they shouldn't, or break when they must. If Napoleon wins at Waterloo, the world doesn't instantly turn into Napoleon's Europe. But Europe's certainty fractures. The Congress of Vienna's neat settlement becomes contested. The conservative restoration loses its triumph. And the 19th century begins with a question mark instead of a period. Because that single victory would echo through diplomacy, nationalism, revolution, and empire building, reshaping not only borders, but the stories people told about power and legitimacy. And maybe the most haunting thought is this. In our timeline, Waterloo is where Napoleon's legend ends. In this alternate timeline, Waterloo is where it evolves into something even more dangerous. A legend that wins. A legend that survives. A legend that teaches the world that the future can still be stolen back, if you take the right hill at the right time. That single decision would have left a mark that echoed for centuries. If you enjoy stories like this, where forgotten details and fragile moments reshape entire civilizations, subscribe for more journeys through history's most haunting what-ifs.